The dead marshes eventually swallowed the graves of the fallen in Dagorlad. Even after centuries, the corpses were visible in its waters, but the tales of the bloodshed and massacre in the Battle of Dagorlad do not end here. What could have triggered a conflict of such proportions? By the Second Age, 3434, the free people of Middle-earth were scared to their bones. With the power of the One Ring, Sauron was becoming more cruel and bolder. Although his plans to control the High Elves had failed, he was not to be deterred. His mind was set on enslaving all of Middle-earth, and Sauron's power had grown so much that complete domination was inevitable. Under these circumstances, the people of Middle-earth suffered. Sauron only needed the 3 elven rings of power to succeed in his plans, and in this quest, he laid waste to many kingdoms. The Noldoran realm, Eregion, was one of the many victims of Sauron's mad quest. Celebrimbor, the ruler of Eregion, was murdered in cold blood. Sauron used his body as a banner afterward, knowing that such cruelty awaited them. All the remaining kingdoms united. Under the leadership of King Gil-galad and Elendil, the armies marched to Mordor. This was the ultimate showdown. The fortune of Middle-earth depended upon the outcome of this battle. In the end, it did not matter who won. The death toll was beyond count. Since then, the Battle of Dagorlad has been known as the most brutal war in Middle-earth's history. But how did it all begin? It all began with the fall of Morgoth. Sauron had been Morgoth's foremost lieutenant. Although the greatest of the Ainur divine spirits, Morgoth was corrupted. He desired power. His mission was to force his will upon Middle-earth. Sauron was to follow in Morgoth's footsteps after his fall. Sauron came up with a scheme to dominate Middle-earth. He planned to rule over everything through the Rings of Power. As the most skilled craftsman, it seemed natural for him to choose the rings to carry out his mission, and so he took up a disguise. Sauron was accomplished at transforming his appearance. He used this to his advantage and transformed into Anatar. With his fair appearance, Sauron walked Eregion to deceive the finest craftsmen. Although Lord Elrond and King Gil-galad saw through him, others were not so wise. The elves of Eregion fell under his spell. Under Sauron's guidance, they made the Rings of Power. 9 went to the ruling men of various kingdoms. 7 went to the Dwarven kings. These Rings of Power had been gifted to the men and the dwarves under deception. Sauron had gone to Mount Doom in Mordor. There, he forged the One Ring to control the others. The 9 kings were ultimately corrupted into the Nazgul. Hence, the rings enabled Sauron to establish his control and dominion. But Sauron was frustrated to learn that there were 3 other rings. Unknown to him, Celebrimbor had forged the 3 rings for the elves. But Sauron did not know the identity of the ring-bearers. Hence, his scheme had been foiled. To learn the identity of the ring-bearers, Sauron waged war with the elves of Eregion. Death and destruction trailed Sauron's path. The battle was violent and brutal. In the aftermath, Eregion was annihilated, and Celebrimbor, the maker of the 3 rings, was brutally murdered. Although the elves forced Sauron to retreat, he was now more powerful than ever. Several rings of power had come into his hands. The stage had been set. The free people of Middle-earth, now aware of Sauron's plans, united. The Battle of Dagorlad was drawing nearer. The kingdoms of elves and men thus formed the last alliance. After several more skirmishes, Sauron successfully planned the downfall of the kingdom of Numenor. After feinting his own death, Sauron struck a mighty blow to the kingdom of Gondor. After launching a stealthy attack, his forces captured Minas Ithil. Sauron had the White Tree of Gondor burned down to express his spite and hatred. The tree, planted by Isildur, struck the hearts of Gondor. It had been a representation of the kingdom. This act demonstrated what Sauron intended to do with Gondor. This act finally prompted the final meeting. Gil-galad, the High King of Noldor, and Elendil, the King of Gondor, vowed to bring down Sauron. Marching through Middle-earth, the alliance was joined by others. The numbers grew as they reached the Misty Mountains, where Lord Elrond joined his forces. The army marched on, eventually reaching Anduin. The river meandered through most of Middle-earth. There, the elves of Mirkwood joined the army. King Orifer led the army of Mirkwood, which included his son Thranduil. The numbers grew further as more elven armies joined in. The final addition to the army's strength came in Khazad-dûm. In later centuries, Khazad-dûm became known as Moria, the kingdom of dwarves. At long last, the last alliance had gathered their numbers. Mordor was near, where legions of orcs were also preparing for battle. But the unity in these various kingdoms was not perfect. The harmony was not without flaws. The Sylvan elves in the rank had only grudgingly joined Gil-galad's leadership. Pride brought cracks in the last alliance, and the results were to show. The Sylvan elves were not armed and armored as well as the Eldar. This, coupled with their disregard for Gil-galad's leadership, struck the first blow for the last alliance. Meanwhile, Sauron oversaw things from his fortress, Barad-dûr. The armies of orcs and other allies of Sauron had gathered in Dagorlad, a desolate plain, dusty, and without a single blade of grass. The fortress of Barad-dûr overlooked the barren land. It was the heart of Mordor, the place where the fate of Middle-earth was to be decided. In their haste, the Sylvan elves marched through on their own. They did not wait for the command of either Gil-galad or Elendil. Tragedy struck the last alliance before the battle had even begun. The leader of the Sylvan elves, Oropher, was among the large numbers that fell. The orcs quickly overwhelmed the warriors. The faction of Umdir was forced to break away from the main battle. They fought the orcs all the way to the marshes nearby. Here, the battle raged violently. The numbers game came into play. Despite their skills and bravery, the elves were ill-equipped and outnumbered. Thousands died in the marshes. Umdir was among those who lost their lives. Such was the death toll that the marshes became known as the Dead Marshes. But it was in Dagorlad that the true battle unfolded. Despite this initial setback, the last alliance was strong. The elves were master archers. The armies were highly coordinated in their attacks. The strength of Númenóreans was infamous. And the dwarves, though in the minority, were as fierce warriors as any. More importantly, the last alliance was armed with the finest weaponry and armor in all of Middle-earth. As a result, the last alliance struck back, and their will and determination bore fruit. The orcs fell in large numbers. All the while, Sauron watched on from his fortress, Barad-dûr. The Battle of Dagorlad raged on for days and nights. Blood and death reigned over Mordor, but the orc numbers started dwindling. The last alliance was overpowering their enemies. The tides of victory were flowing in favor of the free people of Middle-earth. Finally, the last alliance broke through the Black Gates. Barad-dûr was in sight, and Sauron was closer. But the battle had only begun. Sauron's fortress had been erected on a solid foundation. Although the last alliance sieged it, they could not break through. And the orcs, although their numbers had fallen, were not finished yet. Sauron had enough supplies inside to last years, and his magical fortifications helped keep his enemies away. Not surprisingly, the siege continued for years. Attacks were launched from the Dark Tower, the casualties mounted, but both the Alliance and Sauron endured. Both sides knew things could not last forever. Either the Alliance had to give up and retreat, or Sauron had to emerge from his fortress. It was the latter that finally happened. Sauron was forced to come out of Barad-dûr. Anger and malice guided him. With the power of the One Ring, he dealt heavy blows to the Alliance. His power was too much. No skill or weaponry could hold up against Sauron's might. The enemies battled all the way to the slopes of Mount Doom. Gil-galad and Elendil fought Sauron with their spear and sword, but the power of the One Ring was too much. Sauron bested both kings, but he was spent from the effort. Elendil's sword broke as Sauron fell. Isildur, Elendil's son, took up his father's sword. Slashing with all his might, he severed Sauron's finger with the One Ring. Effectively, this ended the battle. The last alliance had won. Sauron, without the One Ring, could not remain in his body. His spirit escaped, vulnerable and weak. The Battle of Dagorlad ended with Isildur possessing the One Ring. Thousands of dead bodies were carried out of Mordor. Elves, men, and dwarves had lain down their lives to defeat Sauron. Breezes of victory blew all over Middle-earth, but all of it was for nothing. The One Ring remained, as Isildur refused to destroy it. Sauron's story was far from over.